You'll never understand business because you were born to spend money, not make it. My father said that to me in a company boardroom while my mother stood beside him and let the executives watch me get humiliated like I was some spoiled guest instead of their daughter. 18 months later, both of them went completely silent when the biggest investor in their company stood up, looked straight at me, and asked why the woman who had saved their future was being treated like a stranger. As always, before we dive into a story with an ending that's going to feel really satisfying for you, let's do a quick roll call. Type present and the city you're watching from in the comments. For everyone who has liked and subscribed, I pray that God makes your problems easier, widens your provision, and keeps your body healthy. Thank you, my friends. Now listen carefully to my story. Maybe some of you already know this kind of pain. You can grow up inside a beautiful house, eat at a long, expensive table, wear clean clothes, smile in family pictures, and still feel like the one person nobody really sees. From the outside, my life looked polished, privileged, and secure. From the inside, it felt like I had spent years standing in a room full of people who had already decided who I was before I even opened my mouth. My name is Audrey Lawson, and I'm the only daughter of Richard and Helen Lawson, the founders of Lawson Biotech, a mid-sized medical supply company based outside Chicago. My father loved saying we were a family-built success story. He used those exact words at conferences, in interviews, even at charity galas. He made it sound like every brick in that company had been laid by loyalty, discipline, and hard work. What he never said out loud was that in our family, loyalty only counted when it benefited him, discipline meant obeying him, and hard work somehow never counted when it came from me. I was 29 when the Real story started, though if I'm being honest, the roots of it went back much further. My older brother, Caleb, was always presented as the natural heir. He was loud, confident, and careless in a way rich men are often forgiven for. He could show up late, make a joke in the middle of a serious meeting, forget the details, and my father would still call him a born leader. I could spend an entire night reviewing numbers, catch mistakes other people missed, prepare backup plans, and my father would say, "You're too emotional for executive work." My mother wasn't the type to scream. Sometimes I think that made her worse. Helen Lawson was elegant, polished, impossible to read when guests were around, and devastatingly cold in private. She didn't insult me in messy ways. She did it neatly, with one sentence at a time. "Audrey, don't overcomplicate things. Audrey, you always take things so personally. Audrey, your father is only trying to protect you from decisions too heavy for you." She had this soft smile when she said those things, which somehow made them sting more. Our house looked like one of those places people post online and caption with words like blessed and grateful. A huge white stone home, black iron gates, high ceilings, fresh flowers arranged twice a week, a kitchen so spotless it looked staged. But it never felt warm to me. It felt curated. Every room was beautiful in the same way a hotel lobby is beautiful. You could admire it, but you couldn't relax in it. Even when I was a child, I knew instinctively that being comfortable there was a mistake. Comfort made you careless. Careless meant vulnerable. Vulnerable meant giving them something else to use against you. I came back to work at Lawson Biotech after graduate school because, at the time, I still believed effort could change the way they saw me. I had studied finance and operations, and I honestly loved the work. I loved looking at messy systems and figuring out what was wrong. I loved patterns, projections, and the feeling that if you paid close attention long enough, numbers would tell you the truth even when people wouldn't. My father told people I was helping out in strategy, but in reality, he kept me in a vague role with lots of responsibility and no real authority. I was good enough to fix problems, not good enough to get credit. The first few months back at the company, I tried to be patient. I told myself that family businesses were complicated. I told myself that my father came from a harder generation and didn't know how to encourage a daughter the way he encouraged a son. I told myself my mother's distance was just her personality. I made excuses for everyone. That was one of my biggest weaknesses back then. I was always translating cruelty into something more polite because the truth was harder to survive. There were little signs from the beginning that something was wrong in a deeper way. Not just emotionally wrong. Structurally wrong. My father had become unusually secretive about cash flow. Caleb, who had zero patience for details, suddenly had access to meetings I wasn't invited to. My mother started asking strange questions over breakfast, like whether I had any plans to move out of state, whether I'd ever consider getting married and stepping away from work, whether I thought women were happier when they stopped trying to compete with men all the time. It didn't feel like small talk. It felt like they were measuring how much resistance I might give if they pushed me aside. One Monday morning, I arrived at the office early and saw the lights on in the boardroom. That alone was unusual. My father hated being there before 8:30. Through the glass wall, I could see him, Caleb, our chief legal officer Martin Pierce, and a woman from outside counsel named Dana Mercer. My father was leaning over the table, talking in a low voice. A folder lay open in front of Martin. I couldn't see the whole page, only a few lines near the bottom, but I recognized the Lawson Biotech letterhead and one phrase that stayed in my head all day. Succession contingency. I didn't walk in. I kept moving like I hadn't noticed anything. But that phrase lodged in my chest like a splinter. At lunch, I casually asked Martin whether there were changes coming to executive structure. He smiled too quickly and said, "Just routine governance updates." Then he added, "Nothing you need to worry about. Nothing you need to worry about." That was the kind of sentence people used when they knew you had every reason to worry. That night at dinner, my father carved into his steak and asked Caleb about a golf weekend with potential partners. My mother asked whether he'd confirmed attendance for a conference in Boston. Nobody asked me anything about work, even though I had spent the last 2 weeks stabilizing a vendor relationship that had nearly collapsed. Finally, I said, "Are there changes happening with the company structure?" My father didn't even look up right away. "What changes?" "I saw Martin and Dana in the boardroom this morning. You look like you were reviewing something formal." He set his knife down, then looked at me with that expression I hated, the one that made me feel like I was 12 again and asking a stupid question. "Audrey, not everything in this company concerns you." I felt my back stiffen. "I work there." "You work around it," Caleb said with a grin. "That's different." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" He leaned back in his chair. "It means you're useful with reports, but that doesn't make you management." My mother sipped her water and said gently, "Let's not turn dinner into another argument." Another argument? I had barely spoken. "I'm asking a direct question." My father finally answered, but only enough to shut me down. "The company is preparing for growth. Legal reviews are part of that. Stop reading meaning into every document you glimpse through glass." Then he went back to eating. That was the end of the conversation for them. For me, it was the beginning of a feeling I couldn't shake. Something was moving under the surface, and for some reason, they wanted me uninformed and quiet. The next few weeks felt strangely controlled. I'd be left off email chains, then forwarded the work later, once the decisions were already made. Caleb would present ideas in meetings that I had drafted in private memos. When I corrected a number or questioned a projection, my father would say things like, "Let's keep this strategic, Audrey," as if precision were some annoying female habit instead of the foundation of good business. People around the table noticed. That was the humiliating part. Not only that they dismissed me, but that they trained everyone else to dismiss me too. One afternoon, I found an assistant from legal leaving a stack of printouts near the copy room. She rushed away when her phone rang, and one sheet slid loose from the pile. I bent down to pick it up and saw the top line. Draft Transfer Framework. Voting Rights Realignment. I froze. I shouldn't have looked longer than that, but I did. There were references to trust protections, temporary voting control, and family governance measures in the event of instability. Before I could read more, the assistant came back, took the page from my hand, and said, "Sorry, confidential." Her voice was polite, but her face looked nervous. Not annoyed, nervous. That night, I lay awake in my room staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what kind of company planning would involve restructuring voting rights without discussing it openly. Lawson Biotech wasn't public, but it did have a board, minority stakeholders, and private investment arrangements. If my father was moving control around, it mattered. It mattered a lot. And if he was doing it quietly, then either there was a major business reason or a major family reason. I had a feeling it was both. Still, I told myself not to overreact.
I was good at that back then.
I could take a disturbing sign, wrap it in logic, and tell myself to stay calm until more facts appeared. That habit probably kept me functional. It also kept me in bad situations longer than I should have stayed. The first undeniable crack came at my grandmother's birthday dinner. My grandmother, Eleanor, was my father's mother. She was the one person in that family who had ever looked me in the eye and spoken to me like I had a brain worth using. She had been sick for almost a year, not dramatically, but enough that every family event carried this quiet fear underneath it. The birthday dinner was held in the private dining room of a country club she liked, and because appearances mattered to my parents, it was done beautifully. Pale roses, gold candles, custom menus, the whole polished performance. Relatives came in from out of town. Senior managers stopped by. A few long-term board members were invited because my father liked blending business and family whenever it made him look powerful. I wore a navy dress, simple earrings, and a smile I had practiced in the car because I knew exactly how those nights went. They always started with toasts and ended with somebody reminding me that I was less essential than Caleb. At first, everything was fine. My grandmother squeezed my hand and whispered, "You look tired, darling. Are you sleeping enough?" I smiled and told her I was fine. She gave me that knowing look older women have when they know you're lying but don't expose you in public. "Don't let loud people define quiet truth," she said. I didn't even have time to ask what she meant, because my mother was already guiding guests toward the table and my father was calling for champagne. Dinner moved in the usual way. My father told stories about the company's early years. Caleb laughed too loudly at his own jokes. My mother floated through the room, smoothing every edge. I mostly listened. Then one of the board members, a kind older man named Gerald Sutton, asked me how the operations review was going. I answered honestly. "We've reduced waste in 2 distribution lines, and I'm still reviewing vendor exposure. I think there's room to improve margins if we stop treating certain legacy contracts like they're untouchable." Gerald nodded with real interest. "That sounds substantial." Before I could say anything else, Caleb gave a little laugh. "Audrey always loves a spreadsheet." A few people chuckled politely. I tried to keep my face neutral. Gerald looked at me again. "No, I'm serious. That's important work." My father lifted his glass and said, "It keeps her busy." There it was. That tone. Light enough to sound harmless. Sharp enough to shrink me in front of a room. I set my water glass down carefully. "It does more than keep me busy." My mother turned her head toward me. "Audrey." I hated the warning in my name. "What?" My father smiled in that controlled way that meant he was irritated. "Not tonight." Gerald looked uncomfortable now, which only made me angrier, because I knew this pattern so well. They would belittle me, then act like I was ruining the mood if I objected. Then my cousin Naomi, who had spent years trying to stay on my mother's good side, said, "I think Uncle Richard means Audrey has talents, just maybe not the same kind that drive top-level deals." My chest tightened. "And what kind would those be?" She shifted in her chair. "You're better with detail. Support roles. Internal things. Support roles. Internal things." Like I was a decorative assistant in my own family. I looked at my father. "Do you agree with that?"
He didn't hesitate.
"Yes." The room went very still. I wish I could say I handled that moment with some kind of cold dignity. I didn't. I felt heat rush into my face, so fast I thought I might cry right there. I was furious with myself for even letting it matter after years of this, but humiliation does not become painless just because it's familiar. Sometimes repeated pain is worse because a part of you always hopes maybe this time will be different. I swallowed hard and said, "Interesting. Since the vendor recovery strategy Caleb presented last quarter was mine." Caleb rolled his eyes. "Here we go." I kept going, because something in me had finally snapped. "And the pricing stabilization memo?"
"Mine."
"The revised warehouse schedule that cut shipping errors?"
"Mine."
"The operational forecast Martin praised in January?" "Also mine." My mother's smile vanished. Audrey enough. But Gerald was staring at my father now, and 2 of the other guests looked suddenly very alert. My father leaned back and clasped his hands together. You contribute research. That does not make you a decision maker. I heard myself ask, very quietly, why not? He answered in the same calm tone people use right before they say something cruel enough to leave a mark. Because knowing facts and leading people are not the same thing. You get overwhelmed too easily. You personalize everything. Business requires steadiness. It was such a polished insult that half the room might have missed how ugly it really was. He was saying I was weak, irrational, unfit. And he was doing it with the kind of language that sounds respectable while it cuts you open. My grandmother put her fork down with a small clink. Richard. He ignored her. Then Caleb, who could never resist. Pushing harder once he saw me hurt, said, "Come on, Audrey. Nobody's saying you're useless. Dad's just saying you're not built for the top. There's no shame in that. No shame in that." I looked around the table. Some people looked at their plates. Some looked embarrassed. My mother looked annoyed, not at them, but at me, as if my face itself were causing the discomfort. I said, "You say that because it's easier than admitting you keep taking my work and presenting it as his." Caleb's smile faded. "Excuse me? You heard me." My father's voice turned cold. "That is enough." "No," I said, and my hands were shaking now under the table. "No, I'm tired of being talked about like a child while I clean up messes nobody even thanks me for." My mother's chair shifted. "We are not doing this here. We do it everywhere," I shot back. "At home, at work, in front of employees, in front of family. The only difference is that tonight other people are listening." My father stood up slowly, which was always worse than if he yelled. It meant he had moved past irritation into punishment. "You will not embarrass me on your grandmother's birthday." I almost laughed because the hypocrisy of that sentence was unbelievable. He had humiliated me in public, but my reaction was the embarrassment. My grandmother looked at me with sadness, then at him with anger I hadn't seen from her in years. "Sit down, Richard." He didn't. Instead, he said to me, "If you want respect, earn it in a place where the stakes are real." I stared at him. "You mean a place where you don't control the outcome?" My mother inhaled sharply. Caleb muttered, "Bad move." The dinner never recovered after that. Guests returned to their meals with the stiff politeness people use when they've just witnessed a family fracture in high definition. My grandmother reached for my hand again under the table, but by then I could barely breathe properly. I sat through dessert without tasting any of it, smiled when required, and excused myself the first second I could do it without making things worse for her. In the club bathroom, I locked myself in a stall and cried in total silence. Not because they had surprised me. They hadn't. I cried because some part of me had still been hoping that maybe in front of my grandmother, maybe at least there, they would choose decency. Instead, they had made it clearer than ever that in their minds, I was a convenient mind with an inconvenient voice. When I got home that night, I took off my earrings, washed my face, and stared at myself in the mirror for a long time. My eyes looked swollen, but underneath the hurt there was something else now. Anger, yes, but also clarity. If they needed me quiet, there was a reason. If they were pushing me down publicly, there was a reason. And if my father was trying to establish over and over that I wasn't fit to lead, then maybe he was preparing other people to accept a future where I had no rightful place in that company at all. From that day on, my name in that house didn't feel like my name anymore. After the birthday dinner, the atmosphere at home shifted from cold to strategic. That's the best word for it. Not emotional. Not explosive. Strategic. My mother started monitoring my schedule in weird, subtle ways. "You're home late. You've been in legal a lot lately. You look tired after lunch. Are you overworking?" She made concerns sound like observation, and observations sound like ownership. Caleb grew more smug. He started dropping comments like, "Some people should know when they're being phased out," then pretending he was joking if I reacted. At work, I noticed I had lost access to one of the shared folders used for board prep. When I asked IT, they said permissions had been updated per executive request. Executive request. My father refused to discuss it and asked why I needed files above my pay grade. Above my pay grade. I almost laughed at that one because half the analyses in those folders had started on my laptop. Around the same time, Lawson Biotech began preparing materials for a round of private capital discussions. We weren't collapsing, but we were stretched. Supply chain pressure, cash timing issues, and too expensive expansions had made the company vulnerable. A major investor could stabilize us or reshape us. My father started using words like vision and legacy even more than usual, which in his language meant he wanted control without accountability. One rainy Thursday, I was asked to bring a revised cost report to Martin Pearson Legal. His office was empty, so I left the file with his assistant. As I turned to go, I saw a thin gray folder on the corner of her desk with a yellow sticky note attached. It said, Lawson Family Trust Update, pending signatures. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe all the little warnings had finally become too loud to ignore. Maybe my grandmother's expression at that dinner had stayed in my head longer than I realized. Maybe I was simply tired of waiting to be informed after the damage was done. The assistant stepped away to answer a call, and I glanced down at the top page. I wasn't trying to memorize everything. I only needed one clear fact.
1.
My eyes landed on a section listing provisional authority in the event of founder incapacity or voluntary transition. Beneath it was Caleb's name. Not mine. Not both of us. Caleb alone, under language broad enough to cover far more than a medical emergency. My stomach dropped. Then I saw something else. A side provision regarding non-voting family beneficiaries. That phrase sat there so coldly, I almost didn't process it at first. Non-voting family beneficiaries. I kept reading until I found the line that made my hands go numb. Current treatment assumption. Daughter's interest to remain passive subject to marital and residential status review. I pulled back so fast I almost knocked the edge of the desk. Passive. Subject to marital and residential status review. I wasn't even being described like a working family member. I was being positioned like a dependent variable. A complication. Someone whose relevance could be adjusted based on whether I got married, moved, stayed, signed, or obeyed. The assistant came back in, and I forced myself to keep my face still. Everything okay? She asked. Yeah, I said. I was just looking for Martin. She nodded, but she was watching me carefully. I left with the blood pounding in my ears. That evening I sat in my car in the office parking lot for almost 20 minutes before driving home. Rain tapped against the windshield while I stared at the steering wheel and replayed that sentence over and over. Daughter's interest to remain passive. I had spent years trying to prove my value to people who had already drafted the paperwork for my irrelevance. I didn't confront them that night. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But instinct told me not to show my hand. If they were already doing legal structuring around me, then anger would only make them faster. I needed information, not drama. Proof, not emotion. The problem was that in that house, getting proof felt almost impossible. A week later, I got it by accident. My grandmother had a follow-up appointment with a specialist downtown, and because my mother was busy hosting a luncheon and Caleb had investor calls, I took her. We spent 2 hours at the clinic, and afterward I helped her into the car while her nurse, a warm woman named Teresa, tucked a blanket over her knees. You're the only one who listens when she says she's cold, Teresa told me softly. My grandmother smiled faintly. Because Audrey pays attention. On the drive back, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, Your father is rushing. I glanced at her. Rushing what? Everything. Papers. Meetings. Legacy language. Men begin saying the word legacy when they are afraid. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Did he tell you something? He tells me only what he wants repeated. She looked out the window at the gray afternoon. But I've seen enough men build companies to know the signs. He's not planning for the company alone. He's planning around people. I swallowed. Around me? She turned and looked directly at me. Yes. I wanted to ask more, but she was tired, and I could see from her face that she had already given me more than she meant to. Even so, the second we got home, I helped her inside, made sure Teresa had her medication notes, and then went to my room with my heart racing. That night I started doing something I wish I had done years earlier. I began saving everything. Not in some dramatic movie way. Quietly, methodically, I forwarded work drafts to a private email account where legally appropriate. I kept copies of my original memos with timestamps. I photographed handwritten notes from whiteboards after meetings. I wrote down dates, comments, and who had been present when certain decisions were discussed. I wasn't stealing proprietary secrets. I was preserving the truth of my own involvement before it could be erased and retold. Then, 3 days later, the first real document fell into my hands. I was in a small conference room reviewing supply exposure when Martin Pierce stepped out to take a call. He had left behind a stack of materials, and when he returned, he scooped them up too fast. One page slid under the table without either of us noticing. After he left again, I bent to pick it up. I should have taken it straight to him. Instead, I looked. It was a summary sheet, not the full document, but it was enough. Private Capital Outreach. Investor Prospect Shortlist. 3 names were listed as serious possibilities. 2 were expected. The third was not. Ashford Strategic Holdings. I knew the name. Everyone in our industry knew the name. They were selective, disciplined, and famous for not wasting time on weak leadership. If they were genuinely evaluating Lawson Biotech, then the company was more exposed than my father had admitted. More importantly, any serious due diligence from a group like that would force sunlight into places my family preferred to keep dark. At the bottom of the page, there was a note in Martin's handwriting. Narrative discipline required. Internal family alignment must appear stable. I stared at those words, so long the page blurred in my hand. Narrative discipline. Internal family alignment. They weren't just preparing business materials. They were managing appearances, which meant I was not imagining the coordinated sidelining. It was real, deliberate, and tied to something bigger than family ego. I slid the page into my notebook before I could stop myself. For the rest of the day, I felt like I had 2 heartbeats, one normal and one panicked. I knew keeping that page was risky. I also knew giving it back would mean losing the first concrete thing I had seen with my own eyes. When I got home, I scanned it, saved a copy to a secure folder, printed one backup, and hid the original inside a plain folder labeled apartment lease estimates. Nobody in that house would ever voluntarily open something that sounded practical and boring. After that, the cruelty in daily life became easier to decode because I finally understood it wasn't random. It was conditioning. My father corrected me more sharply in meetings, often over nothing. My mother began making comments about my future stability in front of family friends. Caleb started acting as if decisions were already his. He'd say things like, "When I'm handling this side next year," then smirk if I looked at him. One night in the kitchen, while staff cleared after dinner, my mother stood beside me at the marble counter and said, "You would be happier if you stopped trying to prove something to men who value different strengths." I looked at her. Is that supposed to comfort me? It's supposed to help you. By telling me to accept less? Her expression stayed calm. By telling you that not every battle is worth your dignity. I almost laughed at the irony. My dignity seems to matter a lot to you only when I'm defending it. She set down her teacup. Audrey, you need to understand this family runs on order, not emotion. The words sat between us like ice. I said, "Order for who?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. In that house, order meant my father deciding, Caleb inheriting, and me adjusting. The isolation got worse after that. Friends I mentioned going out with were suddenly described as bad influences or opportunistic. My father told me I was distracted. Caleb told people I was spiraling. Even small disagreements were used to build a story that I was unstable, oversensitive, and difficult. It was gaslighting in a very polished family business style. No screaming. No broken dishes. Just a constant reshaping of reality until I started second-guessing my own memory. Sometimes I would lie awake asking myself if I really was too emotional, too reactive, too suspicious. Maybe I had misread the trust language. Maybe the investor prep had nothing to do with me. Maybe my father truly believed Caleb was better suited and was just too blunt to say it kindly. This is what manipulation does. It takes evidence and wraps doubt around it until your own instincts feel rude. Then my grandmother called me into her sitting room one Sunday afternoon. It was one of the few warm rooms in the house, filled with books, old framed photos, and a faint lavender smell from the cream she used on her hands. She motioned for me to sit beside her on the sofa. Her breathing had become thinner lately, but her eyes were still sharp. "Richard asked me to review trust language," she said. My heartbeat kicked hard. "Did you sign anything?"
No.
I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. She reached toward the side table and handed me a small folded paper. "I am not giving you a legal document," she said carefully. "I am giving you a note I made for myself after reading language I did not like." I unfolded it. It was written in her narrow, elegant handwriting. "Protect Audrey's voting interest. Delay any transfer pending independent review. Do not rely on Richard's urgency." My throat tightened. "Grandma." She patted my hand. "I may be old, but I am not foolish. Men in a hurry often hope women will die before asking questions." I stared at the note, then at her. "Are they trying to cut me out?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think your father believes he is preserving order. I think your mother believes she is preserving your brother. I think your brother believes he deserves what he has not earned. And I think all three of them will keep lying to themselves while they call it strategy." I felt tears rise, so suddenly I had to blink them back. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" She gave a tired little smile. "Because you are easier to move if you are busy defending your feelings instead of protecting your rights." That sentence changed something inside me. Not because it made me feel strong right away. It didn't. It made me feel sick. Sick that my own family had studied my pain closely enough to use it as a distraction. Sick that every humiliation might have had a second function. Not just to hurt me, but to exhaust me. Keep me emotional. Keep me reactive. Keep me too busy surviving their disrespect to notice what they were building around me. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my pocket. That night, after everyone had gone upstairs, I sat at my desk and opened a new folder on my laptop. I named it simply Personal Archive. Into it went the scanned investor sheet, copies of my original work, time-stamped memos, and a typed summary of what my grandmother had said. I also placed her handwritten note into a slim plastic sleeve and hid it inside a locked drawer beneath old tax files. I didn't fully understand how big it was yet. I only knew it mattered and that if I lost it, I might lose the first clear sign that someone in that family still saw the truth. I closed the drawer, rested both hands on the wood, and whispered to myself, "Something is very wrong here." By then, I no longer felt like I lived in a home. I felt like I lived inside a performance built to keep me blind. The more I noticed, the worse it became. I started seeing how carefully they framed everything around me. If I was quiet at dinner, my mother would say, "Audrey has been in one of her moods lately." If I asked a direct question at work, Caleb would tell people I was intense again. If I pointed out a discrepancy in financial assumptions, my father would sigh and say, "This is why I don't like involving family in operational tension." Hearing that was maddening because he absolutely involved family, just not equally. Caleb could be sloppy, arrogant, and wrong, and that was leadership development. I could be precise, informed, and understandably upset, and that was emotional spillover. A lot of gaslighting doesn't happen through one dramatic lie. It happens through repetition. The same suggestion, over and over, until it begins settling into the walls around you. Audrey is difficult. Audrey is sensitive. Audrey takes things personally. Audrey doesn't understand the bigger picture. After a while, I noticed people in the company using softer versions of the same language. Not because they hated me, because they were absorbing the tone from the top. One afternoon, I walked into a budget review already in progress. My father was at the head of the table, Martin to his right. Caleb sprawled beside him with his tie loosened like he had just done something exhausting, though I knew he hadn't. A few senior managers were there, along with our finance controller, Leah Monroe. Leah was one of the rare people in the company who treated me like a professional without checking first to see how my father felt about it. I took my seat and opened my notes. "Sorry, traffic." My father didn't look up. We started on time. I ignored the comment and glanced at the printed deck in front of me. Within 30 seconds, I saw a problem. These receivables assumptions are too optimistic. Caleb smirked. "Here we go." I kept my voice calm. No, seriously. If those hospital network payments slip even 2 more weeks, the cash timing here gets ugly. My father said, "We're speaking at a strategic level." I looked at him. Cash timing is strategic. Martin shifted in his chair, but said nothing. Leah cleared her throat. Audrey's right that the sensitivity range may need widening. For one tiny second, I felt relief. Then my father said, with that controlled boardroom smile of his, "This is what I mean. She gets buried in risk assumptions and loses sight of decision confidence." Decision confidence. It sounded impressive if you didn't know it was nonsense. People around the table nodded slowly, not because they agreed, but because they knew how to survive him. I said, "Confidence without realism is not strategy." The room went quiet. My father's eyes finally met mine. And realism without authority is commentary. That line stayed with me for days. Realism without authority is commentary. In other words, truth meant nothing if he decided I had no standing to speak it. After the meeting, Leah caught up with me near the elevators. "You weren't wrong in there." I gave a humorless little smile. That's not always useful. She lowered her voice. "Be careful." "With what?" "With how openly you challenge him right now." She hesitated. "There's a lot happening behind the scenes." I studied her face. "What kind of lot?" She looked uncomfortable. "I don't know enough to say. But legal has been requesting unusual reconciliation support, and Martin has asked for older ownership schedules twice this month." Ownership schedules. My pulse quickened. Did he say why?
No, she paused.
I probably shouldn't have said even that. I touched her arm lightly. "Thank you." That conversation should have made me feel validated. Instead, it made me feel more alone. There is something uniquely terrifying about realizing other people can sense a shift, but nobody wants to name it out loud. Everyone becomes polite, cautious, helpful in fragments, and you're left carrying the full emotional weight of a truth that keeps showing its outline without fully stepping into the light. At home, the atmosphere was tighter than ever. My father was taking more calls behind closed doors. My mother's calendar seemed packed with lunches, donor events, and private meetings with women whose husbands sat on boards or moved money. Caleb had started dressing differently too. Better suits, more expensive watches, the performance of seriousness. He would swagger through the house on Bluetooth calls, saying things like, "We need the market to see continuity," and "I can handle the family side." The family side. As if I were some difficult branch to be pruned. One evening, I came into the breakfast room earlier than usual and stopped when I heard my name. My mother was speaking in a low voice. "She's becoming suspicious." My father answered, "She's always suspicious." "No," my mother said. "This is different." I stayed perfectly still in the hallway. Then Caleb said, "She can suspect whatever she wants. She doesn't have leverage." My father gave a short laugh. "Not unless someone gives it to her." My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I stepped in then, because I didn't want to hear the rest from behind a wall like some stranger in my own home. "Good morning." All three of them turned toward me. The speed with which their faces smoothed out would have been almost impressive if it wasn't so revolting. My mother smiled first. "You're up early." "I live here," I said. Caleb rolled his eyes. Always dramatic. My father folded his newspaper. "If you're going to start the day with an attitude, do it elsewhere." That was the pattern. They would get caught, then make my tone the problem. I poured coffee with steady hands only because I was concentrating so hard on not spilling it. "What was I suspicious about?" I asked. My mother set down her spoon. "Audrey." "No, really," I said. "I'd love to know." My father stood, kissed the top of my mother's head like we were a normal family, and said, "You would love to know a lot of things that don't concern your position." Then he left. I stared after him in complete silence. Caleb gave me a pitying smile, which somehow felt worse than his usual arrogance. "You keep making the same mistake." "What mistake?" He stood too, smoothing his jacket, thinking proximity equals power. Then he walked out too. I looked at my mother, hoping for once in my life she would break from them and say something human, something honest. Instead, she took a sip of tea and said, You make things harder for yourself when you force doors that aren't meant for you. I said, I'm your daughter. Her expression flickered for half a second, then settled. And that should have taught you by now that family peace matters more than ego. Family peace. Another one of those phrases that really meant silence. That afternoon, I called my oldest friend, Julia Bennett. No, I can't use Bennett. Let's change that in story. Wait, I must ensure no band name Bennett. Need edit. Use Julia Mercer? But Dana Mercer already. Use Julia Rhodes. Need fix any mention. Continue final output. Must be clean. I need revise in my head. At this point, user sees final only. Let's continue with correct name. That afternoon, I called my oldest friend, Julia Rhodes. We had known each other since college, though over the years my family had done a good job making me feel guilty for confiding in her too much. They said friends didn't understand family complexity. What they really meant was that outside eyes were dangerous. Julia answered on the second ring. Hey, you okay? And just hearing someone ask me that without hidden judgment almost broke me. I don't know, I admitted. She was quiet for a second. Do you want the polite version of this call or the real one? The real one. The real one is that every time you talk about your family, you sound like someone explaining a bruise by saying you walked into a wall, except the wall has your last name. I sat down on the edge of my bed. That's not dramatic at all. I'm serious, Audrey. You keep trying to prove your worth in a system designed to keep moving the goalposts. My eyes filled again, and I hated that I was crying so much lately. I think they're doing something with ownership. Or voting. Or both. Do you know that for sure? Not fully, but I've seen pieces. I lowered my voice even though I was alone. And Grandma basically confirmed their planning around me. Julia didn't rush to fill the silence. That's one of the reasons I trusted her. She let truth settle. Finally, she said, document everything. I am.
Good.
And Audrey. Yeah. Stop telling yourself you're overreacting every time your instincts are right. That should have comforted me. Instead, it hurt because she was right and I knew it. A few days later, my father arranged what he called a family alignment dinner. Those 3 words alone made my skin crawl. Family alignment in our house meant there was already a decision, and the dinner existed so my objections could be framed as emotional disruption. We met in the formal dining room, just the 4 of us. No staff lingering. No guests. No softening witnesses. My mother wore cream silk like she was hosting a donor board. Caleb looked smug before anyone even sat down. My father folded his hands and said, I want us to move forward without unnecessary tension. I almost laughed. That usually means you want me to agree quietly. He ignored that. The company is entering a sensitive phase. Capital discussions require discipline, unity, and clear leadership perception. There it was again. Leadership perception, not leadership. Perception. I said, then maybe stop undermining the person doing half your corrective work. Caleb sighed loudly. This again? My father's eyes hardened. This is exactly why these conversations are difficult. No, I said, they're difficult because you all talk like I'm standing outside my own life. My mother cut in with practice calm. Nobody is attacking you. I stared at her. That line doesn't work anymore. For a second, nobody spoke. Then my father said, your role will remain important, but it will need clearer boundaries. My whole body went cold. What boundaries? Operational support. Non-governing involvement. Internal projects. The words landed in sequence, each one worse than the last. It was all there. Exactly the kind of language I had glimpsed in that trust summary, now dressed up as a reasonable family conversation. I said very quietly, you've already written this somewhere, haven't you? Caleb looked away first. My mother said, please don't start imagining conspiracies. There it was. Gaslighting, neat and elegant. I laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Imagining. My father leaned forward. You are proving my point right now. You hear structure and think persecution. You hear planning and think betrayal. This is why you're not suited for the final call. My hands were trembling under the table again, but my voice came out steady.
So, this is it.
You provoke me, then cite my reaction as evidence. No one answered, and that silence told me everything. I looked from one face to the next. My father, already mentally moving pieces around the board. My mother, composed enough to watch it happen. Caleb, trying to hide satisfaction and failing. I realized then that I was not in a disagreement. I was in an engineered situation. A long one, possibly years long. Every slight, every exclusion, every humiliating little correction had been part of building the same conclusion. Audrey is not fit. Caleb is the natural choice, and the family must act decisively for stability. I pushed my chair back. My mother said, "Where are you going?" I stood. To my room. Since apparently that's the only place in this house where I'm allowed to have a point of view. My father's voice followed me like a blade. Running away won't make you more credible. I turned back at the doorway. And controlling the room won't make you right. Then I left. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door and locked it, something I hadn't done in years. My breath was coming fast, and for a few seconds I really thought I might be sick. I sat on the floor beside my bed because my legs didn't feel stable enough to hold me. The scariest part was not the conversation itself. It was how calm they had all been. That kind of calm only comes when people think the outcome is already secured. I took out my phone and typed every line I could remember into a notes file with the date and time. Then I opened my locked drawer, pulled out the investor shortlist, my grandmother's note, and my saved memos, and spread them across the bed. It didn't look like enough. A note, a page, a collection of records, fragments. But for the first time, I had something more valuable than comfort. I had a pattern. And once you truly see the pattern, you can never go back to pretending a trap is a home. The official fall came 2 weeks later, and they staged it like an act of mercy. Recap. So far, I'd been belittled by my parents, pushed aside in the family company, and slowly realized they were quietly restructuring power around my brother while treating me like a passive inconvenience. By the end of part 1, I had begun saving evidence, and I knew the real attack was about to become official. 2 weeks after that dinner, my father told me to be in the smaller executive conference room at 10 in the morning. He said it casually, like he was asking me to stop by for coffee. "Wear something professional," he added while standing near the front hall with his briefcase in hand. "We'll be meeting with counsel." That sentence made my stomach drop immediately. Meeting with counsel. Not Martin stopping by my office. Not a quick internal discussion. Counsel. Formal. Deliberate. Cleaned up in advance. I stood at the bottom of the staircase and asked, "Why?" My father adjusted his cufflinks and didn't even look directly at me. "Because this company needs clarity." My mother, who was buttoning a pale blue coat beside him, said, "Don't make this more painful than it needs to be."
Audrey.
I stared at both of them. "You haven't even told me what this is." Caleb walked in from the kitchen holding a travel mug, already grinning like he'd heard a joke before the punchline landed. "You really need everything explained slowly, don't you?" I looked at him so coldly, he stopped smiling for half a second. Then my father said, 10 o'clock.
Don't
be late. And that was it. They left the house together, and I stood there in the foyer with that awful feeling spreading through my chest. The kind of feeling you get when the worst thing hasn't happened yet, but your body already knows it's coming. I went upstairs, shut my bedroom door, and opened the locked drawer where I had been hiding everything. My grandmother's note, the investor shortlist, printed copies of my memos, timeline entries, meeting summaries. It still didn't feel like enough to protect me, but it was enough to remind me that I was not crazy. That mattered more than ever that morning. I dressed carefully, not because I wanted to impress them, but because I refused to walk into whatever they had planned looking like I had already lost. Navy trousers, cream blouse, black blazer, low heels. I tied my hair back in a smooth knot and forced my breathing to settle while I looked at myself in the mirror. I remember thinking very clearly, "They want me shaken." That thought helped me more than any comforting phrase could have. Because once I understood that emotional collapse would serve them, I became almost stubbornly calm. By the time I got to Lawson Biotech, Rain clouds were hanging low over the building, turning the windows gray. The receptionist gave me a strange look when I passed, the kind of look people wear when they know something awkward is about to happen and hate being anywhere near it. The smaller executive conference room was already occupied. My father sat at the head of the polished table. My mother was to his left, Caleb to his right. Martin Pierce was there with a legal pad and 2 folders in front of him. Beside him sat Dana Mercer from outside counsel, dressed in a charcoal suit and the expressionless face of someone paid to make ugly things sound procedural. There was also a man I didn't recognize at first, maybe in his late 50s, silver tie, neat beard, glasses. He introduced himself as Victor Hale, independent governance consultant. Independent governance consultant. Even the title sounded like Betrayal wrapped in neutral language. A chair had been left for me at the opposite end of the table alone. That detail almost made me laugh. It was so theatrical, so obvious. They had arranged the room physically the same way they had arranged the story emotionally. Everyone on one side, me on the other, as if the outcome had already been agreed. I sat down and placed my notebook in front of me. My father folded his hands. "Thank you for coming." I looked directly at him. "You made it sound optional." Dana Mercer stepped in before he could answer. "We're here to discuss governance transitions, family role structure, and the company's need for stable executive communication during a sensitive period." There it was again. Stable executive communication. So many polished phrases for one ugly intention. I said, "Say it plainly." Martin glanced at my father, then at Dana. Finally, my father spoke. "Caleb will be taking a more formal leadership position going forward." I held his gaze. And he continued, "Your role will be redefined to support continuity rather than interfere with it." Interfere. The word hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was surprising, because it was so clean. They had found a way to package years of my work, my loyalty, my labor, and my concern into one word that made me sound like clutter. I asked, "Redefined how?" Dana slid a document toward me. "This outlines a non-governing strategic support role with revised reporting lines." I looked down. Revised reporting lines meant I would report under Caleb. My vision blurred for 1 second, then sharpened. My father kept talking. "This is the right move for the company." I looked back up slowly.
No.
"It's the right move for your preferred narrative." Caleb let out a dry laugh. "There she goes." Victor Hale spoke for the first time. "Miss Lawson, this transition is not intended as a punishment." I looked at him. That's interesting because it feels exactly like one. My mother sighed softly, the way she always did when she wanted everyone else in the room to feel sorry for her for having such a difficult daughter. "Audrey, your father has tried very hard to protect your place."
I almost choked on that.
"Protect my place?" "Yes," she said. "But you keep forcing conflict in ways that make cooperation impossible." There it was again. Reversing victim and offender so neatly it could almost pass for concern. I pressed my fingers against the edge of the table. "You spent months shutting me out, taking my work, treating me like I was unstable, and now you're telling me I created the conflict." My father's voice turned cold. "This is exactly what we mean." I looked at Martin. "Did you draft trust language referring to me as passive?" No one moved. The silence in that room was answer enough. Dana said carefully, "I think this meeting should remain focused on present structure." That careful tone told me everything. She knew. I let out one slow breath. "So that's a yes." My father's jaw tightened. "You should be very careful about making accusations. And you should be very careful about pretending I'm too stupid to notice what you've been doing." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "Notice all you want. It doesn't change the fact that you're not built for this level." I turned toward him. "You mean the level where someone else does the work and you take a chair?" His face darkened immediately. "You always do this. You turn everything personal." Because it was personal. It was my life, my place, my future. But in that room, speaking like a human being was the very thing they planned to use against me. Dana tapped the document in front of me. "You are not being removed from the company. This proposal preserves compensation and visibility while reducing governance friction." Reducing governance friction. That was how they chose to describe cutting me out. I looked at the signature page. There was a line for me. Of course there was. They hadn't called this meeting to inform me. They had called it to get my compliance. My mother leaned forward slightly. Sign it today, Audrey. Let this be the beginning of peace. A fake new start. Exactly the kind of manipulation people use when they want surrender to sound healing. I set the paper down carefully.
No.
Nobody spoke for a second. Then my father said, "Excuse me?" I said no. Caleb laughed once, but it sounded tighter now. You don't really have leverage to refuse. I looked at him. Maybe not today. My father's eyes narrowed. This is not a negotiation. I stood up. Dana said, "You should take time to consider." I already have, I said. My mother's voice sharpened. Don't be reckless. I turned toward her. You mean don't make your strategy harder? Then I picked up my bag and walked out. My hands were shaking so badly by the time I made it to the elevator that I had to press the button twice. The second the doors closed, I felt the adrenaline hit all at once. My throat tightened. My chest hurt. I had not signed the document, but I also had not stopped them. They were still moving, still building around me, still counting on the possibility that I would eventually be isolated enough, afraid enough, or tired enough to give in. The minute I got to my car, I called Julia. She answered with, "What happened?" I don't know how she always heard it in my breathing before I spoke, but she did. They tried to formalize it, I said. They want me under Caleb. Non-governing. Support. Peace. Julia was silent for half a beat. Did you sign?
No.
Good. I don't know if it matters. It matters. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. I'm so tired. I know. No, I mean I'm tired in a way that feels dangerous now. Like they're building the room and expecting me to stand in the corner quietly while they explain why I belong there. Julia's voice softened, but not in a pitying way. Then stop standing in their room. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. What am I supposed to do? Walk away from everything. Not everything, she said. Walk toward help. That afternoon she took off work and met me at a small cafe near the river. It was the kind of place my family would never go because the tables didn't match and the cups were chipped in a charming way instead of an expensive one. We sat by the front window while rain slid down the glass, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in a room where nothing was being staged. I told her everything. The meeting, the wording, the pressure to sign, the trust language, my grandmother's note, the investor name. Julia listened without interrupting, except to ask practical questions. Do you have copies? When did you first see this? Who else might know? Has your grandmother signed anything? I answered as clearly as I could. When I finished, she stirred her coffee once and said, "You need two things immediately. A lawyer who is not connected to your family, and a forensic review of what role you've actually had in company operations." I laughed weakly. That sounds expensive. She gave me a flat look. So, is getting erased. That line landed hard because it was true. I spent that night in my bedroom with a packed overnight bag hidden in the closet. I hadn't planned to leave yet, but something in me no longer trusted the house. Not dramatically. Not because I thought somebody was going to attack me in the middle of the night. More because the entire environment had started feeling engineered to wear me down. Every room held a version of the story they wanted me to accept. Every meal, every hallway conversation, every glance across a meeting table. It was becoming impossible to think clearly inside the machinery that was trying to rewrite me. The next morning, I got my answer about leaving. My father was already gone when I woke up. My mother was in the breakfast room reading messages on her phone. Caleb came in halfway through and dropped a folder onto the table in front of me. "What's this?" I asked. He smiled. "Your revised access protocol." I opened it and felt cold all over. They had downgraded my system permissions. Again. More aggressively this time. Certain financial folders removed. Board materials restricted. Legal archives blocked. Even some operational records I had worked on myself were now inaccessible without approval. I looked up at him. "You did this before I even refused to sign, didn't you?" He shrugged. "Contingency planning." My mother didn't even look embarrassed. I said, "You've already decided I'm the problem." Caleb took a sip of coffee.
No.
"We decided you couldn't be trusted with a level you never should have had." That was the moment something in me finally snapped into a different kind of clarity. Not the crying kind. Not the wounded kind. The kind where your grief gets so exhausted it starts turning into direction. I stood up. "I'm leaving."
My mother looked up then.
"Don't be melodramatic." "I'm not being melodramatic." My voice surprised even me with how calm it sounded. "I'm being serious." Caleb smirked. "For a day?" "2." I looked at both of them, long enough to hear myself think. My mother set her phone down. "Running away now will only confirm exactly what your father fears." I almost laughed. That I can function outside his version of me? Her expression tightened. "That you're unstable." There it was. No cover. No softening. Just the real accusation. Finally spoken clearly. I said, "Thank you. That's useful." Then I went upstairs, took the overnight bag from the closet, added my laptop, my document folder, and the plastic sleeve holding my grandmother's note, and walked right back down the staircase. My mother followed me to the foyer. "If you leave like this, don't expect sympathy when things move on without you." I stopped at the door and looked at her. There were so many things I wanted to say, that I had spent years begging for scraps of respect from people who only valued obedience. That her version of motherhood had always been more loyal to order than love. That I was done being studied like a weakness in their system. Instead I said, "Things have already been moving without me. That's why I'm leaving." Then I walked out. I moved into a small furnished apartment Julia helped me find on short notice. It was on the 3rd floor of an older brick building above a florist and a tailor. The hallway smelled faintly like laundry soap and old wood. The kitchen was tiny. The sofa was secondhand. The bedroom window looked out over an alley and a patch of sky. It was the least luxurious place I had lived since childhood. It was also the first place in years where I felt like I could breathe. The first night there, I sat on the floor eating takeout noodles out of a paper container because I hadn't unpacked plates yet. I should have felt ashamed. My family would have definitely wanted me to feel ashamed. A Lawson daughter in a rented apartment with mismatched furniture and no staff, no driver, no polished dining room. But what I felt was something stranger. Relief. I cried after that, of course. Harder than I had in weeks. Once the adrenaline wore off, the loneliness hit. The grief hit. The humiliation of realizing how fully I had been pushed out of my own family and workplace hit. I cried until my eyes burned and my head hurt, then washed my face in a bathroom with terrible lighting and sat on the edge of the narrow bed telling myself over and over that surviving something ugly is not the same as losing. Over the next few days, my parents and Caleb tried all their usual methods. My father sent a short message. "Come back when you are prepared to be constructive." Constructive. Meaning obedient. My mother left a voicemail that sounded almost gentle. "Nobody wants this distance, Audrey. We can still reset if you stop letting outsiders influence your emotions." Outsiders. She meant Julia, or any voice that wasn't theirs. Caleb texted, "Don't embarrass yourself by pretending this is some brave stand. Dad's moving forward either way." I saved everything. Then I made the first call that truly changed my life. Julia had given me the name of an attorney, Rebecca Sloan. Mid-40s, sharp, discreet, independent, with experience in governance disputes and family-held companies. I met her in a bright office downtown with pale walls, shelves full of binders, and no patience for euphemisms. She read the summary I had prepared, examined the copies of my documents, and asked precise questions for nearly an hour. She wanted dates, wording, meeting context, access changes, witness possibilities, all of it. By the end, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You are dealing with 2 battles at once." I felt a knot form in my stomach. What kind? Emotional displacement and structural displacement. She folded her hands. "The first one has likely made the second easier." I stared at her because that was the most accurate sentence anyone had spoken to me in months. She continued, "I can't conclude legal wrongdoing yet, but I can say this, your family's language choices are not casual. If there are trust interests, governance expectations, and a pattern of excluding you while preserving your labor, then you need independent review. Immediately. I swallowed.
Do I have any real rights?
Here, that depends on the underlying
documents, she said.
But based on what you've shown me, I would not cooperate with any internal clarification until we see everything. For the first time in a very long time, somebody with actual expertise was not asking me to calm down. She was telling me my instincts deserved investigation. Rebecca also connected me with a forensic accountant named Owen Mercer, not related to Dana Mercer. Thankfully, Owen was quiet, methodical, and had the kind of face that made you believe numbers were safer with him than with most people. He agreed to review the operational history of projects I had worked on, compare authorship trails, and help identify whether my role had been materially understated in internal governance narratives. I left Rebecca's office with a legal retainer agreement in my bag, a list of document requests, and a strange feeling I hadn't experienced in ages.
Hope.
It wasn't warm or dramatic hope. It was practical hope, the kind built from procedures, records, and truth. 3 days later, another piece of the story flipped. Rebecca had requested preliminary trust and governance materials through the channels available to Minority Family Interest Review, and while we were waiting, she asked whether there had been any recurring business issue my father used to justify urgent continuity. I told her about cash pressure, investor outreach, and the Ashford Strategic Holdings note. She looked up immediately. Ashford? Yes. Rebecca was silent for a second. That matters.
Why?
Because Ashford does not like family chaos hidden behind polished reporting. If they're involved, due diligence could expose more than your father is prepared for. That sentence stayed with me all week. At the same time, life in the apartment began taking on a rhythm. I bought groceries. I learned which radiator clanged at night. I found a laundry place around the corner. Julia came over one evening with paper towels, dish soap, and a ridiculous potted plant she insisted every new home needed. We ate grocery store cake with forks standing in the kitchen because I still didn't have proper chairs for guests. At one point she looked around and said, "You know what this place has that your old house didn't?" I smiled tiredly. "Space for ugly throw pillows?" She laughed.
No. Air.
She was right. The hardest nights were still the quiet ones. The ones where my phone stayed still long enough for memory to come back. My mother brushing my hair when I was little. My father teaching me to ride a bike in the driveway. Caleb and me laughing over stupid cartoons before we grew into whatever we later became. People always talk about abusive systems like they are evil every minute of every day. But a lot of the damage lives in the fact that there were good moments too. Real ones. That's what confuses you. That's what keeps you hoping longer than you should. Still, each morning I got up, showered, got dressed, and kept moving. Rebecca and Owen worked through what we could access. Leah quietly sent confirmation of several operational memos with original metadata trails that linked directly to my authorship. Julia helped me organize chronology. My grandmother, who I worried about constantly, sent a short handwritten card through Teresa the nurse. "Proud of you for leaving the stage before they finished writing your role." I cried when I read that, not because I felt weak, because I felt seen. Then, a week later, Rebecca called and said, "I need you in my office this afternoon." Her tone was so exact that I knew something significant had happened. When I got there, she had 3 folders open on the table. Owen was present too, glasses low on his nose, one finger marking a page. Rebecca looked at me and said, "I have good news, bad news, and clarifying news." I sat down slowly. "Start anywhere." "The good news," she said, "is that your family appears to have underestimated both the documentation trail and the limits of what they can do quietly." I felt my heartbeat pick up. "Okay. The bad news is that they have clearly been trying." She slid one document toward me. "This is a summary from a family trust structure review. You were not imagined as a courtesy beneficiary. You were identified as a meaningful interest holder with voting implications under certain conditions tied to independent review. In simpler terms, you matter more than they wanted you to think. I stared at the paper. My name was there. Not passively, not vaguely. Clearly enough that I could see, right in legal language, that my father's strategy had depended on controlling timing, signatures, and perception around governance before scrutiny hardened. I looked up, barely breathing. So they knew. Rebecca gave me a level look. Yes. Owen pointed to another set of materials. And this, he said, is equally interesting. He explained that based on internal files, revision logs, email timestamps, and meeting support materials, a meaningful number of operational and strategic improvements credited informally to Caleb or to executive leadership had originated with me. Not all of them, but enough to establish a repeated pattern of dependency on my work while preserving a public narrative that minimized my competence. I sat back in my chair, stunned. Anger, relief, vindication, grief. All of it hit at once. For months, I had been surviving on fragments. Now fragments were becoming proof. Rebecca let the silence sit for a moment before speaking again. There's more. We also learned from a secondary contact in the investment review channel that Ashford has requested a final on-site due diligence session next week. I frowned. So, she said, if your father intends to present a clean picture of leadership continuity, that meeting is one of the last places he can still control the room, which means it may also be the best place to break that control. My mouth went dry, not because I was afraid of public conflict, though I was. It was because I suddenly saw the shape of what had to happen. Everything they had done to me relied on managing perception inside private rooms. Family dinners, controlled meetings, quiet legal language, tight little circles where they could provoke, diminish, and define me before anyone else saw the pattern. If the truth was going to matter, it needed air. Witnesses.
Stakes.
It needed to happen where their polished version of events would crack in public. I asked, can we do that? Rebecca's expression didn't change.
If.
We prepare properly. That was the beginning of the climb back.
Up.
From that day on, my life stopped feeling like one long reaction and started feeling like strategy of my own. Rebecca helped me make formal document preservation requests. Owen built a concise evidence structure tying my work to real performance results. Leah agreed, carefully and truthfully, to confirm the operational reality of several projects if asked in an appropriate setting. Teresa, through my grandmother, conveyed that Eleanor had not signed off on anything that would cut me out and was willing to be quoted through counsel if needed. Even Gerald Sutton, the board member who had watched my humiliation at the birthday dinner, quietly indicated he was more concerned about governance integrity than my father probably realized. I also began stabilizing myself in small daily ways that mattered more than I expected. I slept better. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes. I ate regular meals. I walked to a nearby park in the morning just to remind myself there was a world outside boardrooms and family pressure. It sounds simple, but once you've lived inside manipulation long enough, ordinary routines start feeling revolutionary. A cup of coffee you pour in peace can do more for your mind than an expensive therapist's waiting room if what you needed most was distance from the system hurting you. Of course, my family didn't stop trying. My mother sent flowers one afternoon with a note that read, "Home is still here when you are ready to stop fighting." I looked at those flowers for a long time before throwing the note away and keeping the arrangement. That felt symbolic in a way I can't fully explain. The beauty could stay. The message had to go. My father tried a different approach. He invited me to lunch at a private club we used to visit when I was younger. Rebecca told me not to go alone, so I declined and asked for any business communication to be routed formally. He replied with one sentence, "Your paranoia is becoming expensive." Paranoia. That word used to work on me. It didn't anymore. Caleb, on the other hand, got sloppier. When people think they're about to win, arrogance makes them careless. He left me a voice note one night after clearly having had too much to drink. "You could have had a comfortable life if you just knew your lane," he said, laughing a little. "But no, you had to make everything dramatic. Dad gave you every chance to stay useful." I saved that too. The day before Ashford's due diligence session, Rebecca and I sat in her office with printed binders, index tabs, and 3 possible response paths depending on how the meeting unfolded. If my father tried to exclude me entirely, we had one plan. If he minimized me publicly, we had another. If he lied about governance continuity, we had the strongest one. I asked her, "Do you think they know I have this much?" She considered it.
No.
They know you resisted. They know you left. They may suspect you have some documentation. But people like your father usually believe they can outframe evidence if they control the room. I looked down at the binder in front of me. Then, tomorrow matters. Yes, she said. A lot. That night, I barely slept. Not because I doubted the truth. Because I knew truth is not always enough by itself. It needs timing, structure, a place to stand. I kept replaying all the moments that had brought me there. My father's voice in the boardroom. My mother's soft little dismissals. Caleb's smirks. My grandmother's note. The rain outside that cafe. The tiny apartment kitchen. Every part of me wanted tomorrow to mean something bigger than revenge. I wanted it to mean I could finally stop explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. The next morning, I dressed in a dark green suit I had almost forgotten I owned. Structured, clean, understated. I wore small gold earrings, tied my hair back, and looked at myself in the mirror with the strangest feeling. I didn't look like the girl from my parents' house anymore. I looked like someone who had survived them. Ashford's due diligence session was held in the main conference suite on the top floor of Lawson Biotech, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows and a long polished table my father loved because everything reflected nicely in it. When Rebecca and I arrived, I could already tell by the tension in reception that my presence was not expected. Good. One of the executive assistants stepped toward me with a startled expression.
Audrey.
I didn't know you were coming in today. I know, I said. Rebecca, beside me, smiled politely in that lethal lawyer way that made people stop asking the wrong questions. By the time we entered the conference suite, most of the room had already settled. My father was standing near the presentation screen speaking with 2 visitors in dark suits. My mother sat farther down the table, composed as ever. Caleb was near the head position, smiling with that overly confident stiffness people wear when they are trying to project authority they haven't earned. Martin Pierce was there. Dana Mercer too. Leah sat along the side with finance materials. Gerald Sutton was present, along with 2 other board members. And at the far end of the table sat the Ashford team. 3 people. 1 older man, 1 woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, and a younger analyst already taking notes. The older man turned as I entered. He had silver hair, a stillness to him, and the kind of face that gave away nothing too quickly. My father saw me a second later. The expression on his face was small, but I will never forget it.
Not shock exactly.
More like abrupt calculation. His eyes moved to Rebecca, then back to me, and I watched him understand in real time that the room was no longer fully his. Audrey, he said, this is a private session. Rebecca answered before I could. Then it should be no problem discussing private governance representations in front of all relevant parties. That sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. The silver-haired man from Ashford looked between us and said, "Perhaps introductions are in order." My father recovered enough to smile. "Of course. This is my daughter, Audrey. She has had an internal support role with the company." Support role. I almost felt insulted all over again. But then Rebecca set a folder down in front of me, and I stayed still. The woman from Ashford spoke next. "I'm Celia Grant, Managing Director. This is Thomas Voss, Senior Partner, and Eric Nolan, Analyst." Thomas Voss nodded once. "Please sit." I sat. Rebecca remained standing long enough to clarify. "I am Rebecca Sloan, counsel for Audrey Lawson in matters relating to governance, family trust representation, and role mischaracterization material to any investment discussion involving leadership continuity." There are moments when a room changes temperature without the air moving. That was one of them. Caleb gave a disbelieving little laugh. "This is ridiculous." Celia Grant looked at him once, and he stopped making noise. My father's voice tightened. "This meeting is about growth capital, not family theater." I said calmly, Then you shouldn't have used family theater to shape your leadership pitch. The younger analyst's head lifted slightly. Thomas Voss folded his hands. Mr. Lawson, we requested a full and accurate view of governance stability. If there is a material dispute relevant to control, authorship, or executive competence, we need to hear it. My father smiled the way men smile when they're angry but still think charm can save them. There is no material dispute. My daughter has been under personal strain and has misinterpreted internal planning. There it was. Personal strain. Misinterpreted. The same script, only now dressed for investors. My mother added softly, "We've all been worried about her." I turned and looked at her. Even then, with all of it on the line, she still chose the same role. The concerned mother. The sorrowful witness to her unstable daughter's decline. I think some people become so attached to their own false innocence that they would rather burn everything than admit what they did knowingly. Rebecca opened the first binder. "With respect," she said, "we have contemporaneous documentation showing a repeated pattern of limiting my client's access while preserving her labor, minimizing her authorship in operational improvements, and structuring governance language around her as a passive obstacle rather than a substantive interest holder." Celia Grant sat back, eyes narrowing slightly. "Show me." And then, finally, the truth stepped into the room. Rebecca began, with the cleanest pieces first. Original memos authored by me, later presented under broader executive framing. Revision histories. Timestamps. Internal operational recommendations that had led directly to measurable savings and vendor stabilization. Leah, when asked carefully, confirmed that several of the key implementation structures had in fact originated with my analyses. She was visibly nervous, but she told the truth. Caleb interrupted twice. "That's support work. That doesn't make her a leader." The second time, Thomas Voss turned to him and said, very quietly, "It does make misrepresentation relevant." Caleb went pale at that. Then Rebecca moved to the governance side. She did not theatrically wave documents around. She didn't need to. She simply laid out the language. The trust review references. The provisional authority focus. The passive treatment assumption tied to my marital and residential status. The timing of access restrictions. The pressured meeting where I was asked to sign into a non-governing role under my brother. My father's face changed then. Not dramatically, but enough. The color thinned just slightly around his mouth. Dana Mercer tried to step in. "Those were preliminary internal drafts, not executed outcomes." Rebecca replied, "Drafts reveal intent when paired with conduct." Celia Grant nodded once. "Correct." My father looked at Martin, who avoided eye contact. Then came the point that broke them. Rebecca said, "There is one more issue relevant to investor confidence. The company's narrative of stable transition appears to rely heavily on the leadership readiness of Caleb Lawson. However, evidence suggests both dependency on Audrey Lawson's operational judgment and an effort to frame her objections as emotional instability rather than substantive governance concern." She pressed play on my phone. Caleb's voice filled the room. "You could have had a comfortable life if you just knew your lane. Dad gave you every chance to stay useful." It wasn't the worst thing he'd ever said. But in that room, after everything else, it was devastating. Because it was honest. It stripped away all the polished language and revealed the real architecture underneath. Usefulness.
Lane. Control.
No one spoke for several seconds after the audio ended. Then Thomas Voss looked directly at my father and asked, "Why was your daughter's role being diminished while her work remained embedded in core functions?" My father answered too quickly. "Because contribution and leadership are not the same." I heard my own heartbeat. Celia Grant asked, "Then why was governance language addressing her interest at all, if she was functionally irrelevant?" That landed. My father opened his mouth, then stopped. For the first time in my entire life, I watched him fail to dominate a room. My mother stepped in then, but even she sounded less smooth now. This has become a very unfortunate misunderstanding inside a family under pressure. I looked at her and said, "It stopped being a misunderstanding when you all started using my reactions as part of the plan." The silence after that was heavy and complete. Gerald Sutton cleared his throat. I believe that needs to be taken seriously. One of the other board members nodded. So do I.
Caleb was sweating now.
He tried to recover with anger. This is unbelievable. She runs away, hires a lawyer, storms into an investor meeting, and suddenly we're all supposed to pretend she's some savior. I turned toward him fully.
No.
We're just done pretending I'm disposable. That was the line that did it for me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Thomas Voss looked down at the documents one last time, then addressed the board as much as my father. Ashford does not invest into leadership opacity wrapped in family choreography. We asked for stability. What we see is dependence on one family member's work, an attempt to reclassify that member's relevance during active investment preparation, and governance pressure that should have been disclosed. Celia Grant closed her folder. Our process is paused pending independent review. My father's face lost all remaining color. Paused. Caleb said, voice cracking. You can't be serious. Celia looked at him evenly. I am completely serious. My mother's hands had gone very still in her lap. That was when I knew she was panicking, because stillness was always her last defense before control slipped. Then Thomas Voss turned to me and asked the question that completed the whole circle. Ms. Lawson, he said, why is the person who appears to understand this company's operational truth better than anyone else being treated like an outsider? Nobody answered. Not my father. Not my mother. Not Caleb. Because there was no good answer. Because the real answer was ego, sexism, entitlement, fear, and a lifetime of needing me small enough to control. That was the moment they lost the room. Not when Caleb's voice note played. Not when the trust language was discussed. Not even when Ashford paused the process. They lost it when a powerful outsider looked at the evidence, looked at me, and asked out loud the exact question they had spent years trying to bury. Board members began asking for copies. Gerald requested an immediate governance review session. Leah, pale but steady, remained seated with her materials like she had finally stopped pretending the obvious wasn't obvious. Martin looked like a man silently calculating his own exposure. Dana Mercer was already in damage control mode. My father tried one last time. This company will not be hijacked by personal grievance. Rebecca replied, calm as ever. No. It will simply have to survive factual scrutiny. That line ended him. The meeting dissolved after that into procedures, adjournment language, and the kind of tense side conversations that only happen when a polished lie breaks in front of important witnesses. I gathered my folder slowly, not wanting to rush a single movement. My whole body was vibrating with adrenaline, but my face stayed calm. As I stood, my mother finally looked directly at me. There was no softness left now. No performative concern. Just a hard, shocked emptiness, like she had only just understood that I was no longer available for the role she had written. She said my name once, Audrey. I waited, but she had nothing useful to say. So I turned and walked out of that room beside Rebecca, while half the board watched, and my father remained standing in silence behind us. For the first time, the truth stood right in the middle of all of us, and they couldn't run from it anymore. The fallout lasted months. People sometimes imagine these moments end with instant justice. They don't. Real consequences arrive in layers. First privately, then publicly, then structurally. But they did arrive. Ashford formally suspended investment discussions until governance and disclosure issues were reviewed independently. That alone sent tremors through the company. Lawson Biotech had been counting on stabilization capital, and now the board had to face the fact that my father's controlled continuity had helped jeopardize it. A special review committee was formed. Gerald Sutton was on it. 2 external advisors were brought in. My father was not allowed to narrate the process by himself. That might sound small, but in our world, it was seismic. Over the following weeks, more things surfaced. Not dramatic criminal secrets. Not some wild hidden conspiracy from a thriller movie. The truth was more believable and, in some ways, uglier. Years of concentrated credit distortion, succession bias, selective exclusion, and strategic pressure designed to create an official story that Caleb was the only natural path forward. There were also questions about whether certain governance disclosures had been incomplete in investor communications. That part mattered enormously. Rebecca guided me through every step. Owen's analysis became more valuable as internal records were reviewed. Leah's testimony held. My grandmother's unsent note and refusal to sign off on rush language became part of the broader picture of pressure and timing. Even Teresa's notes helped establish that Eleanor had been asked to review documents while unwell but had resisted final approval. My father was furious, of course. At me, at the board, at interference, at anything except himself. He sent 2 messages through counsel insisting I was damaging the family legacy. I responded once, formally, through Rebecca, stating that truthful review is not damage. Misconduct is. My mother tried a different route. She asked to see me alone. Rebecca advised against private meetings, but after some discussion I agreed to one short lunch in a quiet restaurant, with clear boundaries and no business documents. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe some old part of me still wanted one honest conversation. Just one. She arrived in cream again, perfectly put together, as if she believed elegance could still control narrative. For the first few minutes, she talked about my apartment, my health, whether I was eating well. I let her. Then she put down her fork and said, "You've gone too far." I looked at her and almost smiled because there it was. Not "I'm sorry." Not "we were wrong." Not "I see your pain." Just scale. Damage. Control. I said. Too far from what? From repair. I leaned back. Repair requires truth. Her expression tightened. Families survive by closing ranks. No, I said quietly. Families like ours survive by picking one person to absorb the cost. She looked genuinely offended by that, which told me she still didn't understand herself at all. I did what I thought protected the company, she said. I answered. You protected the version of the company where I didn't complicate your plan for Caleb. For a second, she said nothing. Then, very softly, she said, "You were always so hard to place." That sentence should not have hurt me anymore, but it did. Not because I believed it, because it revealed everything. I was never hard to love. I was hard to control and still call it love. I stood up, left money on the table for my untouched tea, and said, that was never my failure. Then I walked out. Caleb's fall was less graceful. Without my work quietly propping up gaps he didn't even fully understand, his limitations became easier for everyone else to see. He could perform confidence in a room for about 20 minutes. After that, details exposed him. Follow-through exposed him. Accountability exposed him. The more scrutiny increased, the worse he looked. He got defensive, then sloppy, then angry. At one review session, he snapped at Gerald and accused the board of undermining family destiny. I heard about that later and almost laughed. Family destiny. What a ridiculous phrase for a man who had mistaken entitlement for talent his entire life. Within 4 months, Caleb was stripped of the accelerated succession pathway my father had been building for him. He kept a title for a while, but the substance drained out of it. People no longer looked at him the same way. Once performance and authorship started being discussed openly, his whole image changed. Respect built on protected illusion does not survive daylight very well. My father remained chairman for a period under board pressure, but not with the same freedom. Reviews, conditions, disclosures, and oversight narrowed the space he used to dominate. He hated every second of it. In public, he framed it as disciplined restructuring. In private, from what I heard, he raged about betrayal. That word again. Betrayal. Funny how often powerful people use that word when someone finally stops helping them misuse power. And me? My life became both smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller in the physical sense. I still lived in my little apartment above the florist and tailor. I bought my own groceries. I learned which cafe gave free refills and which neighbor stomped too loudly after 10 at night. I worked with Rebecca, the review committee, and a temporary advisory process that eventually led to a legitimate operational leadership role being discussed for me, not as a gift from my family, but as recognition of actual work. I didn't rush into accepting anything that mattered to me. I was done receiving my own future through other people's permission. Larger in every other sense. I slept without dread. I laughed more. I stopped apologizing for noticing patterns. I stopped translating disrespect into misunderstandings just to keep peace. My grandmother passed away peacefully 7 months after the Ashford meeting. That was one of the deepest griefs of my life. At the memorial, my family maintained formal politeness, and I did the same. There was no dramatic confrontation there. No need. The truth had already changed the shape of everything. But one thing happened that I still carry with me. After the service, Teresa came over and pressed a small envelope into my hand. She wanted you to have this later, she said. Inside was a short note in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. The ones who see clearly are often called difficult by those who benefit from confusion. Stay clear. I cried in my car for almost an hour after reading that. In time, the company stabilized through a different structure than my father had planned. Ashford eventually returned to discussions, but only after governance reforms, clearer reporting, and the removal of several assumptions my family had relied on. They did not sweep in and make me a fairy tale queen of the company. Real life is not that childish. But they did something more meaningful. They took me seriously. I was invited into a formal operational strategy role with real authority, real documentation, and direct accountability. Not because I was Richard Lawson's daughter. Not because I had publicly embarrassed my family, but because under scrutiny, my work held up. Thomas Voss was there the day the revised structure was discussed. After the meeting, he said quietly to me, "Competence ages well in rooms that finally get honest." I smiled and said, "That's good, because I had to wait a while." He almost smiled back. "A while, yes." As for my parents, consequences looked different for each of them. My father kept some status, but lost the freedom to shape the company like a private extension of his own ego. He also lost something I think mattered to him even more than title.
Certainty.
He could no longer assume his version of events would automatically win because he said them first. My mother lost access to me in the way she was used to having it. Not fully, not theatrically, but in the deepest sense. She no longer had emotional authority over my self-image. That may sound abstract, but for women like her, it is a real loss. She sent cards on holidays. I answered politely when appropriate. But the old door never reopened. Caleb lost the most visibly. Position, momentum, credibility, and the easy inherited glow he had mistaken for merit. Last I heard, he was trying to build something independently with help from people who still knew our last name but no longer trusted his judgment. Maybe he'll grow up one day. Maybe not. That's no longer my burden. And me, I built a life I could finally recognize as mine. I moved out of the apartment eventually and into a modest but beautiful condo with wide windows and a kitchen I actually loved. Julia helped me choose terrible decorative pillows again. Leah and I became real friends outside the office. Rebecca still sends me short, dry emails every so often that somehow sound like both legal updates and life advice. I keep my grandmother's final note in a frame near my desk where I can see it whenever I start doubting myself. Sometimes people ask whether I forgave my family. The honest answer is complicated. I let go of the fantasy that they would become different people just because I had been hurt enough. I let go of the need to win every emotional argument. I let go of the version of me that thought love always meant staying available. That, to me, is forgiveness's useful cousin. But trust?
No.
Trust is built where truth is safe. And for a long time, truth was never safe with them. Now, when I walk into a conference room, I don't hear my father's voice telling me I was born to spend money, not make it. I hear my own.
Calm.
Informed, unapologetic. And every now and then, in very quiet moments, I think back to the girl sitting in that giant polished house wondering why she always felt like a guest in her own life. I wish I could sit beside her for 5 minutes and tell her this. You were never too emotional. You were never too difficult. You were standing in a system that required your self-doubt to survive. Now I know I was never really incapable. I was simply trapped in a family that needed me underestimated, so they could keep calling their fear business. From everything I went through, I learned that people who keep telling you you're too emotional are often terrified you'll stay calm long enough to expose what they've been doing. If your voice is always treated like a problem whenever you speak the truth, please remember that silence is probably serving someone else more than it is protecting you. If you've ever gone through something similar or you want to share your own story, write it in the comments below. Don't forget to share this story with your friends, like the video, and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories.